When the representatives of Earth first stood before the Galactic Council, the chamber rang with quiet amusement that slowly grew into open laughter, because the Council had ruled star systems for thousands of cycles, and humanity was a new species that had barely learned to walk beyond its home world. And the humans knew it, standing there in plain uniforms without glowing crests or floating honor guards, while ancient beings watched from carved thrones of crystal and bone, and the laughter came not from cruelty alone, but from habit, from a galaxy that had seen countless young races rise and fall, and the human ambassador, a calm man named Daniel Carter, did not raise his voice or pound the floor when a council speaker declared that Earth was to submit to council authority, surrender its independent fleets, and open its worlds to inspection, because Daniel had been trained for this moment and knew that anger would only confirm what they already believed, that humans were emotional and weak. And when one of the counselors leaned forward and said that humanity should be grateful for the chance to survive under supervision, Daniel replied in simple words that Earth would not accept terms written by others. And that response sparked another wave of laughter, louder this time, echoing to the vast chamber, while observers recorded the exchange as a minor curiosity, a young race learning its place. And far from the council chamber, on a blue world orbiting a modest star, leaders watched the transmission in silence, because they had expected this outcome and had prepared for it. And in a secure room beneath layers of ocean and rock, Admiral Holt studied the council's reaction with steady expression, noting every pause and tone, because this was not a negotiation to her. It was a test, and the council had failed it, and around her sat fleet commanders, engineers, and analysts who had spent decades building something the galaxy did not believe possible: a unified human fleet, not bound by ceremony or tradition, but by shared doctrine and hard lessons learned in silence. And as the council session ended with a formal declaration that Earth had one standard cycle to reconsider its position before enforcement measures would begin, the laughter faded into recorded history, while on Earth the mood shifted from patience to resolve, because humanity had spent centuries divided, arguing over borders and beliefs. But the moment alien authority had tried to write humanity's future, those divisions had narrowed, and in shipyards hidden in asteroid belts and deep space docks masked by false signatures, vessels began to move. Crews were awakened from long standby rotations, and orders flowed without fanfare, because there was no need for speeches when everyone already understood what was at stake. And on the bridge of the carrier Resolute Dawn, Captain Aaron Blake walked among his crew as final checks were completed, hearing familiar sounds of human machinery, solid and reliable, built not to impress but to endure. And he remembered the first time he had heard about the council, how instructors had spoken of it as an ancient authority that valued stability above all else, and how they had also said that stability often meant fear change, and change was what humanity represented, not in numbers or age, but in adaptability. And while the galaxy measured power in the size of empires and the age of bloodlines, humans measured it in response time and coordination. And as the first fleet assembled beyond the edge of known trade lanes, ships of varied shapes but unified systems, the officers exchanged brief confirmations, because they had trained for years without knowing if they would ever be seen. And now they were ready to be seen, and back at the council, confidence reigned, as reports suggested that Earth had gone quiet, which was interpreted as hesitation or internal conflict, and one counselor remarked that the humans would come to understand reality soon enough. And yet small anomalies began to appear at the edges of sensor networks, dismissed at first as errors, because no young race could field ships capable of masking their presence so completely. And when an analyst suggested a closer look, a senior official waved it away, saying that humans were still arguing among themselves, because that was what young races did. And the analyst complied, though unease lingered, and in the human fleet. As the final countdown ended, Admiral Holt addressed her commanders with calm clarity, stating that their objective was not destruction but demonstration, because the galaxy needed to see, not be told. And the first fleet move as one, slipping into faster-than-light corridors mapped by human mathematics rather than ancient charts, emerging near council space with precision that shocked even some of their own observers. And as alien outposts detected the arrivals, confusion spread because the ships did not match known configurations, did not broadcast ritual identifiers, and did not slow to announce themselves. And in the council chamber, an aide hurried forward, interrupting a debate about trade quotas to whisper that unknown vessels had appeared at the perimeter, and laughter stirred again, thin and dismissive, until the aide added that there were hundreds, then thousands, arriving in structured formations, holding position without aggression, and silence fell because no young race had ever approached council space in such numbers without prior approval, and the speaker demanded clarification, and as feeds were displayed, showing the human fleet in calm alignment, engines steady, weapons power but idle, a realization crept through the chamber, not yet fear, but uncertainty, because this was not a reckless charge or a desperate plea. It was a presence, controlled and deliberate, and on the bridge of the resolute dawn, Captain Blake watched the council feed, transmitted across secure channels, seeing faces that had laughed now stiff with calculation, and he allowed himself a brief smile, because the first fleet had arrived and humanity had not come to ask again, but to be seen as it truly was, and the galaxy was about to learn that laughter had consequences it had never needed to consider before. The sudden silence in the Galactic Council chamber did not last long, because centuries of authority do not vanish in a single moment, and soon the council speaker regained composure and ordered the human fleet to identify itself and state its intentions, framing the command as routine protocol, while beneath the calm words there was tension, because the sensors showed a level of coordination that did not fit the council's assumptions about humanity, and when the human response arrived it was brief and direct, transmitted by Daniel Carter from a secure location aboard one of the forward command vessels, stating that the fleet was present to observe the Council's enforcement preparations and to make clear that any attempt to impose control over Earth would be considered an act of aggression, and the wording was chosen carefully, because humans understood how seriously the Council treated formal language, and yet the counselors bristled at the implication that a younger species could redefine aggression on its own terms, and several voices rose at once, calling for sanctions, blockades, or immediate military response, while others urged caution, pointing out that no hostile action had yet been taken, and in that hesitation humanity gained its first strategic advantage, because delay was something humans had learned to use well, and while the council debated, Admiral Holt ordered the fleet to execute a series of visible but non-threatening maneuvers, shifting formations with precise timing, rotating task groups, and cycling power through shields and drives and patterns that demonstrated control without escalation, and alien observers watched with growing unease, because such maneuvers required training, doctrine, and command structures far more advanced than expected, and reports from border patrols began to arrive, noting that human logistics ships were already positioned along multiple approach vectors, suggesting long-term planning rather than a rushed response. And within Council intelligence circles, analysts scrambled to reassess humanity's profile, discovering that much of Earth's military development had been deliberately obscured through compartmentalization and misinformation, because humans had learned early that appearing weak could buy time, and now that time had been spent, and on Earth, civilian populations were not panicking, because governments had prepared them quietly for years with drills framed as disaster readiness, building resilience without revealing the true reason, and markets remained stable. Communications networks held firm, and there was no sign of the internal chaos the Council had expected, and this too was reported, further complicating assumptions, and as hours passed, the Council authorized a limited response, dispatching traditional enforcement flotilla to demonstrate authority, believing that a show of force will remind humanity of the Council's reach, and the flotilla was impressive by Galactic standards, ancient warships bearing the marks of countless campaigns, crews confident in doctrines that had subdued dozens of species, and when they moved to intercept the human fleet, Admiral Holt allowed it, instructing her commanders to hold position and record everything, because this encounter was not about winning a battle. It was about revealing a contrast, and as the alien flotilla approached, hailing with formal challenges and demands for withdrawal, the human ships did not answer, immediately maintaining formation and silence, and this silence unsettled the alien commanders, who were accustomed to ritual exchanges that reinforced hierarchy, and when the human reply finally came, it was a simple acknowledgement of receipt and a request of the flotilla to halt at a specified distance for safety reasons, and the alien commander scoffed at the request, ordering his ships to continue forward, confident that intimidation would suffice, and at that moment, human targeting. Systems quietly locked and released, not firing weapons, but flooding the alien ships with diagnostic pings that mapped their shields, drives, and weapon ports in seconds, and the data was transmitted back to the human fleet, shared seamlessly, and the alien flotilla suddenly realized that their systems were being read as easily as an open book, and panic flickered across their command channels as warning indicators lit up, not of damage, but of exposure, and the flotilla halted abruptly, breaking formation, because for the first time in centuries, a Council enforcement force had been analyzed, not challenged, and in the Council chamber, the feed showed the alien ships drifting uncertainly before the steady human line, and the laughter that had once filled the room felt like a distant memory, replaced by a growing awareness that humanity had not arrived to beg, threaten, or boast, but to demonstrate a level of preparation that the galaxy had failed to imagine. And as Admiral Holt watched the encounter conclude without a single shot fired, she knew that this was only the beginning, because the First Fleet had done its job. It had forced the Council to see humanity not as a child race, but as a peer that had chosen its moment carefully, and now the galaxy would have to decide how far it was willing to push a species that had quietly prepared for exactly this day. As the enforcement flotilla withdrew in visible disorder, carried with the first undeniable evidence that the Council's assumptions were wrong, the reaction across Council space was uneven, because some worlds responded with alarm, while others clung to denial, and the Council speaker convened an emergency closed session, sealing the chamber to all but senior representatives, where arguments erupted over how such a miscalculation had occurred, with intelligence directors blaming outdated models and diplomats accusing the military caste of complacency. And in that chaos, one truth began to surface, that humanity had not broken any law, had not fired any weapon, and had not violated Council space beyond what precedent allowed for observer fleets. And this made a direct attack legally complicated, something the Council was unaccustomed to navigating, because most prior conflicts had involved clear violations by weaker species. And while they argued, humanity continued to act, and Admiral Holt authorized the release of carefully selected data packets to neutral systems, showing unclassified elements of human fleet coordination, rescue capacity, and defensive doctrine, framed as transparency rather than threat. And this information spread quickly, because many smaller species had long resented the Council's heavy hand and now saw an opportunity to reassess their own positions. And within days, informal channels lit up with questions about human intentions, trade, possibilities, and security cooperation, and Daniel Carter began answering them one by one, not with promises of protection, but with statements of mutual respect and non-interference, which resonated more deeply than grand alliances ever could. And on the military front, human fleet elements rotated positions, demonstrating sustained presence without escalation, crews maintaining strict discipline, because they knew every movement was being watched and analyzed, and Captain Blake enforced routines that kept his crew focused, drills that emphasized containment and response rather than attack, reinforcing the message that humanity was not there to conquer. And this restraint confused alien strategists, who were accustomed to power being displayed through domination, and in response the Council attempted subtler pressure, issuing trade advisories warning members against engaging with Earth. But these advisories were inconsistently followed, because trust in Council judgment had been shaken. And when a neutral transport guild publicly announced a new shipping contract with human systems, citing reliability and efficiency, the announcement spread across the networks as a quiet rebuke to Council authority. And internally the Council began to fracture, with older species pushing for decisive action to preserve credibility and younger member worlds urging dialogue to avoid a conflict they might be forced to support. And as these divisions deepened, an unexpected development occurred, because a long marginalized Council member species submitted a formal motion recognizing Earth as a sovereign equal under Council law, citing humanity's demonstrated capacity for self-defense and adherence to protocol. And while the motion was unlikely to pass immediately, its mere existence altered the debate, because it forced counselors to argue against their own stated principles. And in the human fleet, the news was received with quiet satisfaction, because this outcome had been anticipated in planning models. And Admiral Holt reminded her commanders that patience remained their strongest weapon. And yet not all reactions were political, because on the fringes of Council space, a powerful imperial bloc that had long chafed under Council mediation began mobilizing forces, interpreting the Council's hesitation as weakness and humanity's rise as an opportunity to reshape regional power. And intelligence of this movement reached Earth through human deep-range sensors and allied observers, prompting urgent consultations. And Daniel Carter addressed the Council again, this time with a warning delivered without hostility, stating that destabilizing actions by any power will be met with proportionate defensive measures to protect human interests and civilian traffic, and clarity of that statement sent ripples through military planning circles, because it implied readiness to operate beyond symbolic presence, and as the Imperial Bloc scouts probe human patrol patterns, they encountered layer detection nets and rapid response units that forced them to withdraw repeatedly, suffering no losses but gaining no information, and this too was reported back, adding to growing legend of human preparedness. And within the council chamber, the laughter that had once defined humanity's arrival was now a liability, replayed in private recordings that haunted decision-makers, because it symbolized not just disrespect, but a failure of imagination. And as the galaxy adjusted its calculations, one thing became clear. The First Fleet had not been the end of humanity's response. It had been the opening statement in a longer conversation, one that the Council could no longer control on its own terms. The shift from disbelief to concern within the Galactic Council did not produce unity, but it did produce urgency, and urgency often led to mistakes, because factions that had once cooperated to tradition now acted independently, and one such faction was the Old Security Directorate, a group of veteran species that believed stability came only through decisive force. And without full council approval, they authorized a limited containment operation aimed at testing human resolve, deploying a covert strike group toward a peripheral human colony that lay just beyond Earth's core defensive perimeter, calculating that a swift demonstration would remind humanity of its vulnerability without provoking full-scale war, and the decision was made in secrecy, justified internally as a necessary correction to restore deterrence. But humanity's sensor web detected the movement almost immediately, because human planners had assumed that if pressure came, it would come indirectly, and Admiral Holt received the alert while reviewing fleet readiness reports, and she did not hesitate, ordering a response that was swift but controlled, dispatching a rapid intervention force under Captain Blake's command with clear rules of engagement focused on protection and containment. And as Blake's task group moved through faster-than-light corridors, the crews were calm, because this scenario had been rehearsed countless times, and they knew their objective was not revenge but clarity. And when the alien strike group emerged near the human colony, expecting minimal resistance, they instead found human ships already in position, forming a layered defensive screen that shielded civilian habitats while leaving clear exit vectors open, and the alien commander, startled by the speed of the response, attempted to withdraw. But human ships matched the maneuver effortlessly, maintaining distance and vector alignment, and then the human fleet transmitted a complete record of the alien incursion, including timestamps, authorization signatures, and command chain identifiers, directly to the Galactic Council and to multiple neutral observers, because transparency was a weapon the Council had rarely faced, and as the standoff unfolded, no shots were fired. But the message was unmistakable. Humanity could see, move, and respond faster than expected, and it would not allow quiet coercion. And back in the council chamber, outrage erupted as evidence of the unauthorized operation spread, with several counselors demanding accountability, while others scrambled to deny involvement, and the credibility of the security directorate collapsed in real time, because humanity had not only blocked the operation but exposed it, and this exposure had consequences, as member worlds began questioning what other actions had been taken in their name over the centuries. And in the midst of this turmoil, Daniel Carter addressed the council once more, his tone steady and factual, stating that humanity considered the incident closed provided there were no further attempts to bypass dialogue, and he added that human forces would continue to defend their people wherever necessary, without seeking expansion or retaliation. And that statement, restrained yet firm, contrasted sharply with the council's internal chaos, and across the galaxy reactions shifted again, with smaller powers expressing relief that humanity had chosen restraint, while larger empires reassessed the cost of provoking a species that combined patience with speed. And within the human fleet, Admiral Holt convened her commanders to review lessons learned, emphasizing that the goal remained long-term stability, not short-term dominance, because humans understood something the Council had forgotten, that authority built on fear eventually eroded, while authority built on reliability endured. And as the alien strike group withdrew fully, escorted to the edge of human-monitored space without humiliation or pursuit, The message spread quietly but powerfully. Humanity did not need to punish to prove strength, and that realization unsettled a galaxy accustomed to brutality as proof of power. And from that moment forward, every calculation involving Earth changed, because the first laughter had been replaced not just by respect, but by caution, and caution, once introduced, could never be fully removed. In the weeks that followed the exposed containment attempt, the galaxy entered a phase of uneasy adjustment, because no formal war had been declared, yet the old balance had already shifted, and the Galactic Council found itself struggling to project authority, without provoking a response it could no longer predict, and committees formed and dissolved as reports piled up describing human fleet rotations, diplomatic outreach, and economic stability, all of which contradicted the long-held belief that pressure would fracture Earth internally, and instead humanity appeared more unified than ever, not through ideology but through shared understanding that survival required coherence. And this unity unsettled the Council's older powers most of all, because they had relied on division as a tool, and in private sessions some counselors argued that recognizing humanity as an equal might preserve influence, while others warned that concession would invite rebellion across Council space. And as these debates dragged on, events moved beyond their control, because trade lanes began rerouting voluntarily through human-monitored corridors due to their efficiency and safety, and insurers adjusted rates accordingly, creating economic incentives that quietly favored Earth without any formal agreement, and human scientists and engineers began participating in open galactic forums, sharing non-military research on propulsion efficiency and environmental recovery, framing it as cooperative advancement, which further softened resistance among neutral species, and in response the Imperial bloc that had been mobilizing on the fringes accelerated its plans, convinced that the Council's hesitation signaled decline, and their leadership calculated that a decisive strike against human-forward elements would force a binary choice. Either humanity would retreat, proving its limits, or would escalate, revealing itself as a threat to be contained by force, and intelligence of this intent reached Admiral Holt through layered sources, prompting her to recommend a shift from passive demonstration to active deterrence. And Earth civilian leadership approved the change with clear conditions, emphasizing defensive trade and lives over territorial assertion, and Captain Blake received new orders to reposition his task group along a critical transit corridor frequented by neutral traffic, a move designed to protect commerce while placing human ships directly in the path of any Imperial advance. And as the Imperial fleet began probing the corridor, they encountered a response unlike any they had faced, because human ships did not form a rigid battle line, but a dynamic field of overlapping zones, adjusting in real time to sensor inputs. And when the Imperial commander attempted to feint men to draw a reaction, human vessels responded by reinforcing civilian convoys instead, denying the Imperial fleet leverage. And this pattern repeated until the Imperial leadership realized that every aggressive move only strengthened humanity's position as a stabilizing force, undermining their narrative of chaos, and frustration grew within Imperial ranks, leading to internal dissent that slowed decision-making, and all of this was observed by the Council, which now faced a stark contrast, an empire escalating recklessly, and a young species acting with measured restraint. And public opinion across many member worlds began to shift openly, with commentators questioning why humanity appeared more committed to galactic stability than institutions that claim to exist for that purpose. And Daniel Carter capitalized on this moment by proposing a limited multilateral forum focused on conflict prevention and trade security, inviting Council members and non-members alike. And though the Council initially resisted endorsing the forum, it could not prevent participation. And when attendance exceeded expectations, the Council's relevance was further diluted. And within the human fleet, morale remained steady but grounded, because commanders understood that the most dangerous phase had not yet arrived, that respect earned without decisive conflict was fragile, and that a single misstep could reverse gains. And Admiral Holt reminded her officers that history would judge humanity not by its strength alone, but by how it chose to use it. And as the galaxy edged closer to a new equilibrium, the First Fleet maintained its watch, engines humming quietly in the vastness of space, a constant reminder that laughter had given way to consequences, and that humanity was no longer waiting to be understood. It was actively shaping the terms of its place among the stars. The fragile balance began to strain when the Imperial bloc, facing internal pressure and loss of credibility, chose escalation over retreat, launching a coordinated operation that combined cyber intrusion, proxy raids, and a sudden show of force along multiple corridors, calculating that simultaneous pressure would overwhelm human command and force a visible mistake. And for the first time since the First Fleet arrived, human defenses were tested across layers rather than at a single point, yet the response was immediate and integrated. Because human doctrine treated space not as isolated fronts, but as a continuous system, and Admiral Holt activated contingency protocols that shifted authority downward, empowering local commanders to act within clear intent rather than waiting for centralized approval. And this flexibility paid off as human cyber teams isolated intrusion vectors and fed false telemetry back to Imperial networks, causing their task groups to misjudge distances and timing, while Captain Blake's ships executed rapid intercepts that protected convoys and outposts without chasing bait, denying the Imperials the spectacle they sought, and as clashes occurred they were brief and decisive, human point defense neutralizing incoming fire, while return fire targeted propulsion and command nodes rather than hulls, disabling ships without catastrophic loss of life. And these engagements were recorded and transmitted in real time to neutral observers, reinforcing the pattern of proportionality, and the Imperial leadership reacted with fury, accusing humanity of manipulation and covert aggression, but their claims rang hollow as evidence mounted showing who had initiated each action, and within the Galactic Council the debate finally tipped, because member worlds could no longer ignore that humanity's presence reduced violence, while Imperial actions increased it. An emotion was introduced to censure the Imperial bloc and formally recognize Earth's right to independent defense operations within agreed corridors. And while passage was uncertain, the mere scheduling of the vote signaled a profound shift, and on the ground on Earth, the public followed events with sober attention rather than celebration, because human leaders had communicated clearly that this was not a victory lap, but a responsibility, and industries adjusted to support sustained readiness without war-footing excess, maintaining a balance between civilian life and defense, and within the human fleet fatigue was managed through rotation and support, because planners understood that endurance was as important as firepower, and in a quiet moment aboard the Resolute Dawn, Captain Blake reviewed after-action reports and reflected on how close the galaxy had come to misreading humanity entirely, not as conquerors or victims, but as a force shaped by hard lessons about restraint. And as the Imperial bloc's operations stalled and fractures widened among its allies, back channel messages began to arrive seeking to escalation, and Daniel Carter responded with conditions centered on ceasefire verification and protection of civilians, refusing to trade silence for concessions. And that refusal carried weight, because it demonstrated that humanity's goals were not transactional dominance, but predictable stability. And when the Imperial fleets finally stood down, withdrawing under monitoring rather than pursuit, the immediate crisis eased, but its implications did not, because the galaxy had witnessed a young species absorb pressure from multiple directions and respond with coherence, transparency, and controlled force, and that demonstration settled into collective memory, reshaping expectations. And as the First Fleet held its stations, the laughter that had once greeted humanity's arrival was no longer just regretted. It was understood as the last sound an old era ending, replaced by a quieter, more careful calculation of what it meant to face a species that had learned how to be strong, without needing to prove it loudly. The aftermath of the Imperial withdrawal left behind not celebration but reassessment, because power revealed without conquest forces observers to confront their own assumptions, and across the galaxy strategic councils convened to update doctrines that had not anticipated restraint as a dominant strategy, while the Galactic Council prepared for its most consequential session in centuries, knowing that whatever decision emerged would redefine its legitimacy. And as delegates gathered, the chamber felt different, less theatrical and more cautious, because every representative understood that words spoken now would echo far beyond tradition. And when Daniel Carter took the floor again, there was no laughter waiting for him, only attention, and he spoke plainly, outlining humanity's position with careful simplicity, stating that Earth did not seek seats of privilege or veto power, but demanded recognition as a sovereign equal with the right to defend its people, trade freely, and participate in shaping shared security norms. And he emphasized that the First Fleet's actions were not an exception, but an example of how humanity intended to operate, predictably, transparently, and proportionally. And as he spoke, counselors reviewed compiled data, showing reduced piracy, stabilized corridors, and increased trade efficiency in regions where human forces operated. And these facts were difficult to argue against, and opposition voices raised concerns that recognizing humanity would encourage other powers to challenge the Council. But supporters countered that the challenge had already occurred, and ignoring it would only accelerate fragmentation. And while debate continued, news arrived that several non-council systems had formally aligned their traffic regulations with human standards, not as an alliance, but as a practical choice. And this external validation tipped undecided delegates, because influence measured by imitation was something the Council valued deeply. And when the vote was finally called, the motion passed narrowly, recognizing Earth as a sovereign equal participant and affirming its right to independent defense within mutually agreed frameworks, and the announcement rippled across the galaxy, marking a moment that historians would later identify as a turning point. And within the human fleet, the response was muted but meaningful, because recognition had never been the sole objective, but removed a constraint that had limited long-term planning, and Admiral Holt ordered a gradual transition from demonstration posture to integration posture, rotating some elements home while establishing liaison detachments with willing partners. And Captain Blake oversaw joint exercises focused on rescue and disaster response, reinforcing the message that human strength extended beyond combat, and these exercises built trust faster than treaties ever could. And yet not all reactions were positive, because remnants of the Imperial bloc and other hardline factions began spreading narratives portraying humanity as manipulators who had ambition behind calm language, and human intelligence tracked these efforts without overreaction, understanding that fear often follows change. And Daniel Carter addressed these claims indirectly by inviting independent observers to audit human operations, a move that disarmed critics by offering scrutiny rather than secrecy. And the audits confirmed what had already become evident, that human command structures prioritize civilian protection and clear escalation thresholds, and as reports circulated, resistance softened further. And on Earth, the public absorbed the news with a mix of pride and gravity, aware that equality in the galaxy brought not just opportunity but obligation, and educational institutions expanded programs focused on interstellar law and ethics, preparing a generation to navigate complexities beyond simple victory narratives. And as months passed, the first fleets presence evolved from a symbol of defiance into a reference point for stability, consulted rather than challenged, and the galaxy adjusted its rhythms accordingly, slower to mock, quicker to calculate. And as Admiral Holt looked out at the stars from a quiet observation deck, she understood that the greatest change was not in fleets or councils, but in perception, because humanity was no longer a question mark or a punchline. It was a known quantity, and known quantities demanded respect. And that respect, once earned, carried consequences that would shape the future far more deeply than any battle ever could. The long-term consequences unfolded quietly rather than in a single dramatic moment, because true shifts in power rarely announce themselves with explosions, and as the galaxy settled into a new pattern, the Galactic Council adapted or faded depending on its willingness to change, with some institutions reforming to incorporate transparency and shared security models inspired by human practice, while others lost relevance as worlds chose arrangements that proved more reliable, and humanity did not rush to fill every vacuum, because restraint had become part of its identity. And Admiral Holt oversaw the gradual drawdown of the First Fleet from its initial posture, replacing mass presence with distributed cooperation nodes that responded to crises rather than patrol for dominance. And Captain Blake eventually handed command to a younger officer, returning home with a quiet sense of completion rather than triumph. And Daniel Carter continued his work not as a symbol of defiance, but as a familiar figure in negotiations, trusted because his words had consistently matched human actions. And over time, the story of the Council's laughter became a lesson taught in academies across multiple species, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a warning against complacency, because it illustrated how arrogance blinds even ancient powers. And smaller civilizations took comfort in the precedent that strength could be demonstrated without conquest, while larger empires learned that intimidation no longer guaranteed obedience. And on Earth, the memory of standing alone before a dismissive galaxy became a cultural anchor, reminding humanity why it had chosen preparation over bravado and unity over spectacle. And when new species eventually stepped onto the interstellar stage, uncertain and underestimated as humanity once had been, It was often human envoys who argued for patience and respect, having learned firsthand the cost of dismissal. And so the era that followed was not defined by human rule, but by human influence, subtle yet persistent, shaping norms through example rather than decree. And in the end, the greatest impact of the First Fleet was not that it arrived in strength, but that it forced the galaxy to confront a simple truth it had forgotten, that power without understanding invites resistance, and respect earned through consistency endures. And from that realization, a more careful, if not always peaceful, galaxy emerged, one in which humanity's place was no longer questioned, because the laughter had ended, and what replaced it was something far more lasting, recognition born not from fear, but from experience.